Okay, so we are in the Torah portion, Tavo, and I'm going to just briefly review what we did last night, and then we'll try to finish that out fairly quickly if we can. And then what I want to do is shift over to the Song of Songs, because my plan is to alternate back and forth between you and the Monday class, where one class will get the Torah portion, and the other one will get Shir HaShirim, and so it'll be balanced, because I don't know which is better. I'll just go back and forth, and that way it'll be even. If people are like, oh, I'd really like to get on that Shir HaShirim and do some discussion there, but I'm on Monday night, that way we can go back and forth. And so let me pull up, share screen, Tavo. And I wasn't sure what to entitle this, so I just went ahead and entitled it the International Mezuzah, because that's pretty much what we have. We have a lot of rocks moving around in the Torah portion, by the way. And so we'll try to briefly decode that so that we can at least get into some preliminary discussion of Shir HaShirim and give you a chance to maybe think about starting a notebook or note cards with a vocabulary list that will help you decode the Song of Songs. Because if you know what the words symbolize, and in some cases, it symbolizes multiple things on multiple levels. That's what's so difficult. And so if you'll start a vocabulary list, then 5 years from now, when you unpack another layer of symbol, you can add to it. And it'll take better and better and better form as you study. So, okay, just briefly. Same way we did last week with Tavo, I wanted to go back to the first mention of the title of the Torah portion, or the verb in the title of the Torah portion. And so with Kitetse, we learned what it means when you go out. And so in Tavo, in this Torah portion, we're learning what it means when you go in. And last night we looked at Bo as it has so many meanings, and so I just crystallized it into the basic meaning of Bo, which is to go or to come, and lots of applications. Then I wanted to go back to the first mention, where that particular verb that is found in Tavo is used, just like we did last week with finding it in the third day of resurrection. We found out the first context for what it means to bring forth. When you go out. And so here our first context for Tavo, when you come in, with the verb yavo, is used in Genesis 2:19. And it has to do with bringing the animal kingdom to Adam, to meet Adam. So they're brought in, they enter in, and he decides the essence of the animal, and he calls it by that name. And then our second mention, 3 verses later in Genesis 2:22, the same thing happens. What became apparent in verse 19 is that Adam was looking for a suitable helper, a helper who would be against him, a helper who would oppose him, who if he strayed from the path. And he realizes out of all these animals that are brought to him, there is not one that is a suitable opponent. That's actually what a wife is. She's a suitable opponent because she was formed in order to help the man get in touch with his better side. And what do I mean by that? I mean with the way. I don't know if we've ever done a study on the phrase "the way," but if you haven't, there's some good ones out there. At any rate, when the man strays from the way, if he has a suitable helper, then she will oppose him. And she will guide him back onto the path of the spirit. Out of all the animal kingdom, there was not one creature who was a suitable opponent who could help him, because remember, neged means to oppose, to stand against, basically in your face. And so at the same time that she's next to him, neged, she's also opposed to him, neged. And that's what makes her a great helper. Her job is to oppose him when he strays from the path, to make sure he gets back on it. And so after Adam can see for himself that there's not one animal in the creation who's going to make a suitable opponent, who's going to be concerned with getting him back onto the proper path to the tree of life, then we see in verse 22, the Lord God fashioned into a woman the rib which he had taken from the man and brought, and that's where we see the verb pop up again, of bo, in its form, vayeviah. Vayeviah. Not easy to pronounce that one. And he brings her to the man. And of course, we know in the same way that he called all the living creatures their names, now he calls her Isha. He says, because she was taken out of the man, she was taken out of the Ish. She is suitable for me because she will oppose me when I stray from the path. She will function as that parable of the Holy Spirit, like we see in Proverbs, where she's the Holy Spirit, the spirit of wisdom, the spirit of understanding, the spirit of knowledge, who will block the path and say, get back on it. You're on the wrong one. Get back to the tree of life. That's a suitable opponent. Someone who will oppose you when you're straying and who will help you when you're on the path. She's hardwired for that from the beginning. And so in Tavo,
here's what I found.
What in the world? This watch gone crazy. Don't look that up either. We see this same relationship in Tavo. We see that Adonai has brought Israel to the land, and they're about to be introduced to one another after a long separation. And so in a sense, what Moses is doing, he's like the shadchan, the matchmaker. He's functioning like in the capacity of Elohim, who was like the first matchmaker, when he says, okay, you're right, Adam, none of these suit you. You needed to see that. You needed to know that you were different from a beast. And so here's a human being who's in your image, and you're made after my image. So now you get what's going on. So here, Israel is being introduced to its mate. They're being introduced to one another as suitable mates for one another, because in this case, the land is going to function like Eve did to Adam. And in this Torah portion, you can't get through the Torah portion without understanding that fact that we were taught in a more of a paleo prophecy in Genesis 2, that if Israel is in the land itself and they begin to stray from the path, then it will be the land itself that begins to discipline them. They will begin to be opposed. All sorts of horrible things will happen if they misbehave and stray from the path. And so we get this, the two mountains, the Mount of Blessing, the Mount of Cursing, to show you that Israel can now experience either side of the same coin of the Torah, of the tree of life. If you walk in the way, then you've turned your back on the Mount of Cursing, and you're now embracing the mountain of blessing. If you turn the other way, if you turn toward the cursing, rebelliousness, disobedience, spiritual laziness, and so forth, if you turn in that direction, then you've turned your back on the blessing. And so you can't say, where's my blessing, when you're misbehaving, because the matchmaker already told you when he introduced you. That's the first context of Ki Tavo, an introduction of suitable mates, so that we'll understand that everyone else is unsuitable for us. The animals are unsuitable for us as mates. The heathen nations are unsuitable for us as mates. It's only those who walk in the path of the Torah who are suitable mates, not just for our relationships, but who are a suitable relationship for the land of Israel itself. She's specially hardwired that way too. And so we have to decide which mountain we turn toward, because it's really clear in the Torah portion that going into the land is going to activate this special quality of the land to its mate. And she'll have to now do her job. She'll have to do the job that Eve was supposed to do. Instead, she's the one who takes the fruit and gives it to the man, and then they get off the path together. She didn't function in her role of guarding the garden. That was also her dominion. If you look at the language of it, they were both told to subdue. It was Adam calling the animals. It wasn't the animals calling Adam names. Adam is called by Elohim. And so who calls your name indicates your place of authority. And so the man and the woman were to have authority over the animals. The animals were not to be naming human beings. It's a matter of compatibility and suitability in order for there to be blessing. And so when they both strayed off of the path, neither one of them properly functioned in their roles in the garden. So we're not going to go through the curses, those curses again. And we can pick up here. We looked at the stones of 27, 1 through 3, where it says, you shall set up for yourself large stones, avanim gdolot, and coat them with lime and write on them all the words of this law when you cross over, so that you may enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, a land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, promised you. And so 3 times in this Torah portion, Moses is going to mention that it is a land flowing with milk and honey. That's why I want to start moving into Shir HaShirim in this lesson, so that you can see the significance of the milk and honey in the land of Israel as it pertains to its ground level, you might say, of the Garden of Eden. But these stones, and the mezuzah in the picture is the mezuzah on the grave of Jacob and Leah at Hebron. And you can see they've used natural stone. They've not cut the stone to decorate it. And that's the way that they had to do the stones that they set up with the words of the Torah on it. It's also the same type of stones they had to pick up out of the Jordan when they carried them to Gilgal to assemble an altar. They had to be uncut stones. And so you can see that they've tried to replicate that in building this mezuzah for the tomb of Jacob and Leah, of making it. And it's a pretty large one too. I didn't take a wide enough picture that you could see how big that is, but it's a pretty significant stone that they've got used there as a mezuzah. And so I refer to this as the National Mezuzah because it was erected on the eastern side of the Jordan in the land of Moab as a mezuzah to the door to Israel that the nations could see when they came in. They would have to acknowledge the mezuzah, the Torah that's written on the doorpost of the land, and acknowledge the special quality of that land and the code of behavior that's even required of nations, the Gentiles, the Goyim, who might come into that land for whatever their business might be. And so I reiterated the point that you already know. even though you can wander all through Israel as much as you want, the official entrance in terms of your inheritance, your spiritual inheritance, you have to go through the Jordan. And it's the crossing there is adjacent to Jericho and Mount Nebo on the other side. And so if you don't go through that door in Scripture, then it doesn't have the same impact as going through as a people and replicating the Reed Sea crossing, because we know the same things happen. And in fact, my cousin sent me a newspaper article. She lives in Texas, and they just came through this Hurricane Laura. And she sent me a newspaper article that said when the hurricane came in, that the Neches River flowed backward for 12 hours. And she thought that was pretty incredible because she had never heard of that river flowing backward, much less for 12 hours. And I think we're told in the Psalm more information about the Jordan at the crossing, that not only did it stand up in a column, but it, I believe, tells us the geographical point to where it even backed up and flowed backward to that particular location. And so it wasn't just a miracle of stopping the river. In the psalm that we read at Passover every year, it tells us that it fled, that it ran away. It didn't just stand up, it also ran away and ran backward. But that's our crossing. It's necessary. And in the same way that Moses had to tell him to be silent at the crossing of the Reed Sea, we see that also. He says, when you cross the Jordan, in Deuteronomy 27, 9 through 11, he says, Moses and the Levitical priests spoke to all Israel, saying, be silent and listen, O Israel. This day you have become a people for the Lord your God. You shall therefore obey the Lord your God and do his commandments and his statutes, which I command you today. Moses also charged the people on that day, saying, when you cross the Jordan. So the same silence that they had to observe at the crossing of the Reed Sea as they came out of the realm of death, now they're observing that same silence as he opens the door to the land of Israel, as he parts the waters of the Jordan in the same way, stands them up like pillars, even causes them to run backward, which is an impossibility at that time of year. I don't know if you realize in the month of Nisan how much water flows down through there because the mountain snow is melting. It's not just the end of the rainy season in Israel, it's also the snow melt. And so in the natural world, it's impossible for either the waters to stand up in a pillar or for them to run backward. So it's truly a miracle that matches what the previous generation saw. And it's also going to match in Revelation 8:1, where it says, when the Lamb broke the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And so I suspect that silence in heaven is a marker that's pointing us back that something significant is happening, that the redeemed are about to go through an entrance. And so let's do the same thing with Jordan, since it's such a key thing in the crossing, that it had to be marked, not just with stones on the other side of the Jordan, it had to be marked with stones inside of Israel. It had to be marked with the stones in the river itself. And so we go back to the first mention of the Jordan. In Genesis 13:10, it says, Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord. And so here we have a direct reference to something we could only connect with the Garden of Eden, because he says it's like the garden of the Lord, whatever he saw. And we know he was seeing into a spiritual realm because it says he lifted up his eyes. And so he's seeing beyond his natural present realm. What did Lot see? he saw a place that was well watered everywhere. And it appears to him to be like the garden of the Lord. So that's our first mention. The Jordan is associated with the garden of the Lord, and the fact that it's well watered really helps us because we know that the rivers of Eden were what marked the boundaries of it. That you have the Pishon River, you have the Gihon River, you have the Chidikel River, and then you have the Parat River. And so Jordan, which means to descend, it's helping us think of, I believe, and don't write this down as fact, but it's just the way that I see it because I'm visualizing what the rivers of Eden would have looked like, the circular pattern that they have. I believe the function of the Jordan River is similar to how the Parat River connected the area beneath the throne to the Garden of Eden, and then it separated and watered the whole garden. Likewise, because we know we fell and out of that spiritual realm when we sinned. I believe the function of the Jordan, which comes from Yerad, to come down, to descend, and we know the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel and the trumpet of God at the resurrection. So what's going to happen? I think the Jordan is giving us this physical symbol of a river that it comes down from that spiritual place. And when we cross over, it defines what a Hebrew is, because we have to avar the Jordan. And from avar, we get Ivri, which is Hebrew, one who is crossed over. And so that descent represents for us the ascent, the spiritual ascent that begins the moment you step foot, literally, in the Jordan River. And then the way parts. And they have the context already of the crossing of the Red Sea, where Moses associates what they're seeing with the Yeshuat, the salvation of the Lord. And so who helps us cross that river? Do we cross on our own merits? No, because we don't have enough to survive that crossing in the natural realm. But with Yeshua, it comes back to look at the journey in the wilderness. Even the rebels, he fed them. Even the rebels, he put shoes on their feet. Even the rebels, he put garments on their back. Did they die in the wilderness? Yes, they did. But he still took care of them. And they were able to remain with the congregation. But think of what you know about Eden, being watered from that upper Eden, and how this main river just keeps descending. It comes from beneath the throne, waters the whole garden. And so understanding that the Garden of Eden, which is the third heaven, also called paradise or Gan Eden, Paul is the one who helps us understand that it's the third heaven when he describes his visit. But that realm is hidden to us unless, like Lot, we are gifted at some point with being able to lift our eyes and see into it. What we don't realize is we are actually seeing it. Every time we look into the word, we're seeing it. It's not perceived with the natural eye. So you're seeing it with a spiritual eye that's still, there's a veil there. But this realm, the way that it's described, is no higher than the height a dove would fly, or the tops of the balsam trees, which aren't very tall at all. We know that sometimes what is called the chariots of Israel were seen in the mountains. So yes, in terms of physical natural height, we can see that the activity there is higher than the natural person. It doesn't mean that it's in the stratosphere where you can't breathe normally. In fact, that's the very definition of air in Greek that Paul describes where we're going to be caught up. It's a place that Strong's tells us where you can breathe naturally. It's not even up in thin air. So if he's talking about a mountain, it may not even be as high as the Rocky Mountains. We'd have to go back to where Elisha saw the chariots in the mountain, look at that mountain and understand, the chariots are right there. And one of the midrashes about the chariots of Israel, and that's what Elisha's servant said. I believe he said, my father, the chariots of Israel. And the chariots of Israel, in some contexts, are seen as the patriarchs. They are called the chariots, not the chariot. There's a Merkava above that Ezekiel saw. And I think you see that in the movement of the Garden Rivers, where the spirit of Adonai is represented there. But we're not going to go down that road right now. But the chariots of Israel, they're seen as like the protectors. Those who are concerned about Israel is seen as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And they're thought to be the ones who are instrumental in transporting you. If you're deemed a righteous person, then they are dispatched as a chariot of some form. What does that mean mystically? I don't know. But just understanding in a Jewish mindset how they see this, because Yeshua alludes to it when he's talking to people about the resurrection. He talks about the patriarchs and about sitting down and having the meal with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as the chariots of Israel in the tradition makes sense in the context of what Yeshua said. And they are seen as those who kind of help us cross over. And even in the parable that Yeshua told about the rich man and Lazarus, the rich man, after he dies, he's talking to Father Abraham. He says, Father Abraham, as one of the chariots of Israel, singing, you're the transporter. Couldn't you do this? And so that it kind of helps us in terms of like, where is it? Well, it's there. Just trust that it's there and it's very close. And you're familiar with this graphic, but again, I just wanted you to visualize the rivers of Eden and how they would appear like chariot wheels within a chariot wheel. And the definition of a river is something that is burning and shining. So in order to cross a river, and all that the Yarden represents, because remember, they're putting a huge set of, they're putting up 12 huge mezuzahs on the other side, on the doorway into the land. And they had to have been huge to have held the entire Torah on them. So they're going to need divine assistance in crossing over this river. And do they receive it? Yes, they walk through the water and they're not burned. They walk through the water and they're not drowned, which is one of the promises to the righteous. And so at this point, Moses has them erect these stones, basically set up a huge mezuzah at the door to the garden. And when it happens, it's like the mountains skip, the Jordan turned backward until they crossed over. So you say, well, how do I get across there? Well, I don't know, but somehow it's like that. So we're going to go back one more step, not just to the first mention of the Jordan. I want to go back to the shoresh, to the root of Yarad, which is the root of Yarden or Jordan. And this is interesting because it starts in Genesis 11:3. And I put in there 3 through 5. It goes back to the Tower of Babel. And I wanted you to see the attempt to build something that would preempt the building of Jerusalem and Israel. It says, they said to one another, come, let us make bricks. Bricks there is, I put the whole construct, Nilbina. Brick is going to be Libnah. Goes back to Laban. Where did Laban live? He lived up in the area of Aram. And so there's a whole lot of symbolism too that goes with the name Laban because of these bricks. At any rate, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And you need to know what that phrase is. Nisrafa, lisrafa. So you can hear a doubled root there of seraph. And you know what seraph is because you know who the Seraphim are. These are angels who were burning. And in the wilderness, when Israel misbehaved, it was Seraphim, snakes, who attacked them. And if you go back far enough, the idea of a dragon or a serpent was not always a negative symbol, by the way. In fact, one of the tribes of Israel is called a serpent in the positive sense of what it is, not in the negative sense of what it is. And so there's the burning, it's like a double burning, nisrafa, lisrafa. And they used brick, levana, for stone, aven. Right? This is exactly what the Israelites have had to set up as the national mezuzah, or at this point, what Moses set up was the International Mezuzah. Joshua was going to set up the national mezuzah. But they used the brick, the levana, in place of stone, aven. Remember, it had to have been uncut stone. Instead, they used something man-made, levana. And they used tar for mortar. They said, come. See there? Tavo, come. Let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. Which heaven do you suppose they were going for? I would suggest they were trying to build into the garden. And I think there were dark forces at work here too. But it says, let us make for ourselves a name. And now you see how the Tavo situation goes all the way back to Genesis 2, where Adam named the animals. He named the beasts. And remember, I says animals have no business naming human beings. Well, this is exactly what these people are trying to do. They're trying to make for themselves a name rather than walking in the image of Elohim and obeying his laws. Rather than submitting to his authority, they want to build their own name. I don't want you to name me. I don't want you to tell me what I am or who I should be. And they say, otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. They understood already that there was a long-term plan. And like we said, we have no idea what ancient people knew, but they knew a lot. And then it says the Lord came down. That's where we see the first mention of Yerad. He came down to see, number one, the city, and number two, the tower which the sons of men had built. He's interested in this city that they have built. And so what we see here is an attempt to run out there ahead, to build a city that's going to function like Jerusalem is designed to. Ultimately, we know that Jerusalem will unite mankind, and its temple will reach into heaven because there's going to be a Yerad. There's going to be a descending. And then these two realms will be one again in the future. And the temple is the focal point of that. And so this long-term plan of drawing down the presence, reuniting mankind with the garden, and that close presence that mankind enjoyed there, they're trying to build it their own way. They're trying to make their own name. And remember, it was on the third day of creation, it says the dry land appeared. and it appeared at its appointed time and appointed place. And we know that the ultimate redemption is going to occur at an appointed time and an appointed place. Rather than wait for Eden to descend and to see that dry land, what they're attempting to do is make their own name one, which is our very statement of faith. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. He is one. They say, rather than allow ourselves to be scattered, because he has called our name and therefore he has the authority over us to disperse us in order to do the work that he wants done in the earth. Instead, they would rather stay together and be one. And there's intense power. There's intense spiritual power. And more importantly, intense soul power, which is what we have in common with the beast. When large numbers of human beings become of one mind, they become very dangerous because there is an incredible power of the soul that was planted within us to keep us alive. It's our life force. You put all that energy and force together and get people on the same page, they are dangerous. They are glorious when they're obedient, when that uniting of the souls is in order to obey the word, but when they unite to disobey, it's extremely dangerous. And so he strikes them with confusion. And they just start babbling, which is where we get Babel. But look at the contrast between all the talking and the confusion of talking that went on. Contrast that with the silence that the Israelites observed when they exited the door of death and when they entered the door of life at the crossing of the Jordan River. Stand still and see the salvation of Adonai. Right? The opposite is what you're seeing at the Tower of Babel. We are not going to wait for the salvation of Adonai. We will make our own name one in the earth. They even attempted the brickwork that's going to connect them with the throne. They're trying to reach up into that. They're doing exactly what they said they're trying to do. We're trying to reach into heaven. We're trying to get back into the garden. Remember in Exodus 24:10, it says, they saw the God of Israel, and under his feet there appeared to be a pavement, a livnat of sapphire, as clear as the sky itself. Now compare that, you can see the same root word right there, back in Genesis 11. The bricks that they were using, nilbana, brick, levana, bricks, where it says make bricks, that's actually a word for making bricks. It's not like two separate words that we have in English. It's a verb, the act of making brick. So you get the verb for making brick, and then you get the noun for baking, for the noun for brick. And how do they make it? They burned. They're even using a process with that root there, seraph, that evokes in us, and especially the fact that it's doubled, where we can see the seraphim around the throne. So we know what they're trying to do. And so here's a few facts about the throne itself and the error of what they were doing at Babel. We know the pavement or the brickwork under the throne was of sapphire. It wasn't man-made. Was not man-made. Our path to the throne is not man-made. In fact, the tablets of testimony were said to be made of sapphire and inscribed with the finger of God, it said. And we know that righteousness and justice of the Torah are the foundations of the throne. And so in their conspiracy, they're conspiring to build the Tower of Babel. They're attempting a brickwork, a pavement, but they cannot make that pavement of the same sapphire, of the same stones that is under the throne. And you can see the intense power of idolatry. When you believe you can do what God does in disobedience, that you can be like God. We also have that intensive description there, seraph, which comes from Seraphim, the burning angels that could appear as biting serpents in the wilderness. When you disobey the Torah and you're a part of the nation of Israel, then the Seraphim can discipline you and punish you. Because remember, his presence was there with the people. They had a high degree of responsibility. They're about to assume an even higher degree of responsibility as they go into the land, especially now that they put up the International Mezuzah. But you can see that this, I don't want to say energy, that wouldn't be quite descriptive. But anyway, the presence of the Seraphim around the throne. And I've gotten some questions recently about why do the Seraphim, their wings are here, here, and here. I don't know. I have some ideas, but I don't know that it would be fruitful to say. At any rate, the Babylonians are bringing in this intensive burning. Maybe they're trying to duplicate the work of the Seraphim around the throne. Whatever it is that they're doing, whatever it is that they're responsible for, there's an attempt, but we can see it's falling short, falling short, falling short. Everything they try to imitate, it's falling short. Nevertheless, it's dangerous. And in fact, when it just says they use the tar for the mortar, it's two forms of the same word, by the way, chamar. And that is first used to describe the slime pits of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Lot saw the garden of the Lord. So you see the attempt there, trying to replicate something that is holy. But what it did do is unite mankind in idolatry. Remember, they said, let's make for ourselves. It's the self-worship. They thought they would force their return back into the garden. They thought they could do battle with heaven to get back in there. But what that would have done is to introduce sin back into the garden. And from what Adonai says about it, you almost think that it was possible that they might blunder in there. But if they did that, they would be introducing sin back into a realm of holiness. And so their punishment was difficulty and confusion. And understanding what I believe up to that time, I believe everyone was speaking the Edenic language, which is described to us in Hebrew. And I believe they were all speaking Hebrew. And that the 70 language that resulted from the Tower of Babel were it was just like this. You see how their attempt was like, okay, we know what it was, kind of. We'll see if we can replicate it with the work of our own hands. I think the same thing is going on here. That the confusion of the languages was simply evidence of mankind's attempt to replicate that which is holy and to take authority over the garden improperly. And so that's why we have confusion in languages. But by putting up these international mezuzot at the door to the promised land, Israel is warning the nations as well as themselves that when you enter into the house of Adonai, so in essence, they're entering his house. I know his house is in Jerusalem, but his land is also part of his house, his holdings, because remember it says on your gates, not just on your house. You don't just put the mezuzah on your house, you put it on your gates. And so you put this warning out here at the entryway. And as you see this mezuzah, or 12 mezuzot, as you approach the Jordan, you're going to see that for Adonai to come down to his house, there's a price. For his presence to be in the land, there's a price to pay. And that price is obeying the commandments. And later we read, there's one law for the stranger and the native born. If you're going to be in this land, you have to abide by these commandments. And so there has to be this preparatory work in order to go into the house. And the commandments have to be obeyed when you go out to work and when you come into the house. Remember, he says, blessed will you be, and you're going out and you're coming in. So coming in is a place of rest, but then going out is a place of service, whether you're working in the field, whatever the work it is that you have to do. And so that sapphire brick road in the Yarden is simply the commandments themselves. That's the brick. You can't man make it. He's already made the Torah. How can you make the Torah? But when you make up your own laws, you're doing brickwork like the people at Babel. And you can build that tower, and think you're building it all the way into the Garden of Eden, but it will never be the sapphire brick road. So we've got these stones of witness as a national or international mezuzah. And it says in 28:6, blessed shall you be when you come in, blessed shall you be when you go out. So they were seen as not just a national mezuzah, but as an international, because they were set up outside the land at the doorway. And they do have a special significance to the nations. And I took this out of the Midrash. It says the stones were inscribed with the commandments in the 70 languages of the nations, so that they could learn it, since they had already refused it at Sinai, at Shavuot, which makes Acts 2 very significant. The fact that the Torah was offered again in the 70 languages at Shavuot in Acts chapter 2, even though they had refused it then. It says afterward, they could not pretend they weren't warned about the special qualities of the land and its people, Israel. It says, and this is just a continuation from page 295. It says the 7 nations who inhabited Israel, the Canaanites, were thus warned and could have been permitted to remain as protected strangers if they'd repented. Instead, they had to be annihilated. It says the Gentiles sent scribes to copy the Torah from the stones, but they never improved their deeds. It says the great stones bearing the Torah in the 70 languages. No, it doesn't say that. I said that. And I already mentioned that. The tongues, speaking in tongues at Shavuot in Acts chapter 2, is a reminder of us of these international mezuzot being applied at the doorway to Israel, where you would pass from the world into the promised land. This is out of the Midrash. Ultimately, it says the stones informed the Gentiles that God's anger was kindled as a result of their idol worship and abominations. And these international mezuzot are viewed as an apocryphal prophecy. They would hold it at the same level that we would say hold the books of Daniel or Revelation. Like, this is a warning. And so Joshua took the 12 stones of the Yarden crossing. These are different stones. Now Moses sets up the international mezuzot. Joshua, as they cross the Yarden River, he sends one man from each tribe to go back and to collect a stone from the riverbed of the Jordan. And then they had to carry those stones, and they were going to build an altar with those uncut stones. So you can imagine they had to have been given superhuman strength. In fact, one midrash says that the entire nation was able to fit between the staves of the Ark of the Covenant, and that it flew. Who knows? But there's a lesson embedded in there. How could they do that? Well, if it's telling us that the entire nation, and part of that was, it said they were not carrying the ark was carrying them. And that's to be a lesson about the word. We think that we're supporting the Torah, but it's actually the Torah that's supporting us as we walk. At any rate, this crossing is an impossibility at this time of year, for it to just dry up like that. But they had to take it to Mount Ebal in order to make the sacrifices and to go through the ceremony of blessing and cursing. And went ahead and put a picture I had of the two mountains there. So you could see at least, how the Ark of the Covenant, the priests, and some of the Levites would have been circled between the two mountains during the ceremony. And then you would have the 6 tribes on each of the 2 mountains, so that you understand that when you embrace the blessing, you turn your back on the curse. When you embrace the curse, you turn your back on the blessing. And that was the language that Adonai used in the passage I read last night when Achan stole the loot that he wasn't supposed to take. And he says, now you're going to have to turn your back to your enemies. You're going to have to expose yourself. So it says Joshua, in Joshua 4:9, it says Joshua erected 12 stones in the Jordan where the Israelites crossed. It says, then Joshua set up the 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan at the place where the feet of the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant were standing, and they are there to this day. And so if we go again back to the Talmud and we go to Sotah 34a, 35b through 36a, there's a passage there that explains what is hard to piece together from the texts. But it says, each stone could be carried by a single representative of the tribe. The entire congregation accompanied them to Mount Gerizim, where Joshua erected a stone altar for a national feast and rejoicing. They inscribed the Torah on the stones of the altar in all 70 primary languages again, dismantled the altar, and brought them to Gilgal, where Joshua erected them as a monument, and it says in 1 day. And this is in addition to the 12 stones that were placed in the Jordan itself. And the purpose of this, Joshua tells Israel in Joshua 4:24, he says, it's so that all the peoples of the earth would know the hand of Hashem, that it is mighty. Because Israel has a history and they have a memory, they know who they are as a people, but the peoples of the earth are confused, which was the result of the Tower of Babel. And he says, we're putting these stones back in place so that the peoples of the earth would know the hand of Hashem, that it is mighty, that it could begin resorting out that confusion, because that was their fear. We'll get scattered all the earth. Because of imperfect understanding, they couldn't see that the salvation was also in the scattering. They felt like they would lose their power, and we do. Did Israel lose power when it was scattered? Yes, it did. But there was a divine purpose in that scattering. But the gathering, when Yeshua gathers his people, right now our minds can't even comprehend the spiritual force that we will be part of when we are one, according to his plan, not according to ours. If you want to see the incredible power of the soul for evil or Yeah. Well, not full evil. You might say it's neither one. Go to a sports venue where they have tens of thousands of people and they're all cheering for one team. And you'll be able to feel it. You'll be able to feel it down at the soul level. Whether you're for that team or not, you will feel the incredible force of those many souls together as echad. And in this, how you see the power of an army. It's to get all those souls pointed in the same direction. They can be a great destructive force. So 3 times, Moses describes the land of Israel and Tavo as flowing with milk and honey. We know milk, honey, wine, and balsam are said to flow through the 4 rivers of Eden. And each symbol is going to represent something that is restorative to the creation. And if you look at the many blessings that are given in Tavo, I think you can trace each one to one of these 4 rivers. We have milk, which represents the milk of clean animals. They would milk goats, they would milk sheep, they would milk cows. And it was a blessing. But when we trace it back to Eden, we can see that it connects us with the animal kingdom. Remember, it was our job to call the animals, not the animals' job to call us. And so in the restoration, when Mashiach comes, then we see an animal world that's no longer going to be under the curse with us. And so we're going to see a kinship with the animal kingdom restored. And at least on the holy mountain, you will see peace among the animals themselves, whereas now they are separated into predators and prey in the food chain. But he says they will no more kill or destroy on my holy mountain. And so the blessing of milk is the blessing of an animal kingdom restored to one another and restored to mankind. The honey, there's actually 3, there's more than 3 kinds of honey, but typically in scripture, you're reading about either bee honey or date honey. But either one, whether you're talking about bee honey or date honey, it represents not just the sweetness of the Torah, which is under your tongue. Remember in the Song of Songs, it says milk and honey are under your tongue. And so it's the Torah, it's sweeter than honey and the honeycomb. So it's this pleasantness, this sweetness of the Torah, and you can see it in the sweetness of a plant world that's bearing seed. And we know that the seed is the word. And so there's that fruitfulness of the word in the garden, represented by this honey and the fruitfulness of that plant world and the pollination. It's kind of like the birds and the bees that Brad used to sing. Kind of like that, because in order to produce the honey, a bee is going to have to do his work among the flowering plants. If we're talking about date honey, if you know anything about dates, you have to have a male and a female, and they have to pollinate. And now they try to do it by hand. But again, without the male and the female date palms, you're not going to get dates, and therefore you won't get honey. There was a very unexpected play on words right there. Let's go on to wine. That might be proper. Or maybe not. Wine, the joy of holiness. And remember, it says he poured in the oil and the wine, the kind that restores my soul. And so wine is restorative to the soul. It represents the joy, not joy of debauchery, but the joy of holiness, because we use wine and kiddush to sanctify the Shabbat and the high holy days. It's a way of representing holiness. And it can also represent our speaking fellowship with Elohim. And here's the verse, Genesis 35, 14 through 15. It says, Jacob set up a stone pillar to mark the place where God had spoken to him. Right? Remember back in the garden? He would come into the garden in the cool of the evening, and they could hear his voice walking in the garden. And Jacob realizes, oh, God spoke with me here. I need to mark the place. And here's what he did to mark the place where he heard God speak. It says, then he poured wine over it as an offering to God and anointed the pillar with olive oil. And Jacob named the place Bethel, which means house of God. And so wine has, it symbolizes a lot of things. The holiness of our relationship, the intimacy of our speaking fellowship with Adonai, being able to bear his presence, which we can't do in a fallen state. Marking the place of the house of God. It also represents serving with joy and gladness. In Deuteronomy 28:47, he talks about the curses. He says, because you did not serve the Lord your God with joy and a glad heart for the abundance of all things. And so wine as a representative of joy represents how we serve in the garden with a glad heart. The garden doesn't want sad souls. The garden is a suitable mate. The garden is compatible with those who serve the Lord their God with joy and a glad heart for the abundance of all things in that garden. And then finally, balsam. And there's other meanings too. As we get more into the Song of Songs, we'll work more with what the balsam represents. But just in a nutshell, it's the scent of good deeds that cling to Israel. When we do a mitzvah, when we obey a commandment, to do or not to do, we leave a scent. It's a spiritual scent. And it goes back to, remember, it says when Messiah comes, he will not judge by the sight of his eyes or the hearing of his ears, but with righteousness he will judge. And there's a Hebrew word embedded in there that's not really translated, but basically it means Messiah, he's going to have this sense of reach, which means smell. And it's related to ruach, for spirit and wind. And so basically when we do a good deed, we kind of leave a scent of balsam trailing behind us. And he's going to scent that. It's not something you sense in the natural realm. And we also know that the balsam treetops are the marching grounds of the armies of Adonai. So when he says the armies of God marching in the treetops in 2 Samuel 5, 23 and 24, and then also in 1 Chronicles 14, 14 through 15, he's describing a realm. He's telling them, don't be afraid, telling the army below, don't be afraid, because the armies of God are marching right above you. They're marching in the treetops of the balsams. So don't worry. There's a scent of good deeds in a spiritual battle, or there should be. Because as you enter into a spiritual battle, if you're entering into it without that scent of good deeds trailing after you, you don't necessarily have all the heavenly help that you need in the situation. And so here's your homework if you want to do it, in addition to what I gave last night. And it was to kind of get you prepared to get into the Song of Songs and the four rivers that were determined based on how the Song of Songs reads as milk, honey, wine, and balsam. And so I've compressed it into one chart, but I could recommend doing two. I don't like to mix up my curses and blessings because I'm too OCD. And after all, they were on two mountains. So have one chart for your blessing mountain and then have one chart for your cursing mountain. And divide them up into your columns into milk, honey, wine, and balsam. And then take your blessings and see if they will fit in any of those four rivers. If you can see that any of those four rivers might be a source for that blessing. And my example was the milk blessing, which goes back to the milk of the clean animals and the restoration of the animal kingdom. I picked one, as he says, Adonai will give you bountiful goodness and the fruit of your animals. And then for balsam, I picked, if you observe the commandments and go in his ways, all the peoples of the earth will see that the name of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh is proclaimed over you. And to me, that represents the scent of those commandments trailing behind us, so that the peoples of the earth, they're looking at us like that International Mezuzah. We're just happen to be walking around as an International Mezuzah. And then I took a couple of the curses. He says, cursed shall you be in your fruit basket. Well, I put that in the honey column because I think it represents the plant world and the ability, again, to bear seed according to kind and compatibility. And then under the wine column, I put, if you do not listen to the voice of Hashem, and that's out of the art scroll, by the way, going back to wine representing the place where Jacob heard the voice of Adonai. And he says, if you do not listen to the voice of Adonai, and then it goes on and gives a curse there. So that was just an example that I tried to compress for you. But again, if you've got kids or grandkids that you're trying to work with, I think this will work the same way with kids as it does with adults. It helps you sort through things. In the same way that you can do the matching verses from Leviticus 26 and Bechukotai with Tavo, because they're twin chapters, I think kids can do this too, right? And it allows them to go through that sorting process in their heads. And when you sort things, there's a part of your brain that'll do things for you in terms of embedding the understanding. So we'll stop there. And then I'll just show you let me get it pulled up here where I can see it, then I'll share that. This is what we'll start getting into more next week, but I wanted to go over those four rivers with you before we do. And this is, well, I thought I had the vocabulary words on here. Maybe I didn't. Oh, well. I'll have to look through and see what I've done. At any rate, that's what I want to do. I'm going to help you as we go through some songs to build that glossary for yourself. And as we go through it, it's very likely that you're going to pick up on symbols yourself that I haven't seen yet, because it's that deep and that high and that wide. And so you'll see things. And if you do see something and you make a connection, feel free to bring that into the after class discussion so we can all share in it and then add it, to our store of understanding. And it'll be good moving forward. And I don't know how long it would take us to do the entire Song of Songs. It could take us a year if we're just doing one class each week. But hey, if we're looking for the resurrection, we need to make sure we're in love when it comes.